especially here in the US. So as Emily said, I've worked in this space of religion and ecology at an international level now since about 2009. I wear a number of different hats. I am the co-founder and director of a Hindu environmental organization called Bhumi Global. Bhumi is a Sanskrit word which means Mother Earth, and I've been running that effort now since 2009, so that's the main thing I've done my professional life. But I also wear some other hats. As Chantal Elkin was on the screen, I'm an advisor to her program at WWF International. I'm on the advisory board for the UN's Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. I also chair the UN's Multi-Faith Advisory Council, which is the only faith council advising the UN mandated by the UN system. And then a number of other hats I wear in the religion and ecology space, both here in the US and in other spaces as well. So I'm kind of steeped in this world, and Emily is an old friend, and when I was working at Oxford, at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, where Bhumi started, that's where I first met Emily, so I'm grateful for the invitation and to meet all of you. And so that's where I come from. Just a bit of background, I was born in England. My mum is from India, my dad is Indian, but he was born in East Africa. But I now live in New Jersey, and I've been living here in the United States for about 7-8 years or so. And I come from a Hindu background. Specifically within Hinduism, there are different, what we say, traditions or lineages or sampradayas, as the Sanskrit word. I come from the Vaishnav sect, and specifically the Gaudiya Vaishnav sect, that is the Vaishnav sect from Bengal, or more commonly known as the Hare Krishnas or the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. And so that's the Hindu tradition I belong to and have been for about 20 plus years now. And so Emily asked me to speak a bit about Hindu ideas and Hindu framings when it comes to this work, which I will, and then I'll move into some of the interfaith work I'm doing at the UN, and then I'll end with some thoughts, reflections, meditations that a number of us are having in this space, because the religion and environment space is a quite sizable movement, although we all know each other. Lisa and Chantal are very good friends, and I work closely with both of them. So when we start with the Hindu idea, I would say there's no one Hindu idea when it comes to the environment, but there are different Hindu framings, and I'll just share some insights into those, knowing that we have limited time. The first is that there's a Hindu understanding that the planet or the earth is the body of God, and you see that within different Hindu texts. And one of my favorite quotes is from the Bhagavad Purana, one of the Hindu texts, where it says that the rivers are the veins on the gigantic body, the trees are his hairs, meaning the hairs of God, and the omnipotent air is his breath. So it gives this very beautiful image that the rivers are the veins of the body of God, the trees are the hairs of the body of God. There are other verses that say the mountains are the bones of the body of God. And so you have this understanding of Hinduism that what we live on is God. But then you have this other complementary or different understanding, which is that the earth is a goddess, Bhumi, and that Hinduism has many gods and goddesses, and they take form in the material realm to serve certain purposes. And so Bhumi is a female goddess, she has an eternal form, but when she manifests in the material realm, she takes the form of the earth. And so therefore she's considered one of the 7 mothers within Hinduism, in addition to the cow and the priest and the wife of the priest and the nurse and so on like that. And so there's this understanding that the earth should be treated with the same love and respect that we treat our natural mother and other mothers that we have in the world as well. And then there's also this understanding that God is present, not just that God is the planet, but God is present within the elements of the planet as well. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna, who is the speaker of the text, who is an incarnation of God, says that I am the taste of water, he is the light of the sun and the moon. He says that he is the original fragrance of the earth, he is the heat in fire, and he is the life that all that lives. And so you can see, no matter which way you want to approach it, and which tradition you belong to in Hinduism, you'll bump up against the idea of God in different manifestations being present in the planet, in the natural elements, in the oceans and the rivers and the trees and mountains. And so you just can't get away from the fact that the earth, the environment, our ecosystems are divine, are sacred, depending on which perspective and which school of thought you belong to within Hinduism. And then that's further reinforced by different Hindu deities or avatars or incarnations. And so two of the most prominent are Krishna and Ram. And so Krishna was a cowherd boy. He lived in the forests of Vrindavan. He spent his days looking after cows, and I'll speak about why cows are important. But he lived an agrarian lifestyle. He lived with farmers. And Krishna, although later on became a prince and a wealthy person, let's say, it's that form of Krishna as a cowherd boy which is most revered and loved within Hinduism as God. God is a cowherd boy that looks after cows and plays in the fields. And then Ram is another famous Hindu deity, which I believe is popular across other parts of Asia as well. Ram spent 14 years living in the forest with his brother Lakshman and his wife Sita when they were exiled from his kingdom. And again, God lived in the forest, and so there's a lot of imagery, a lot of teachings, a lot of philosophy around how does a king live in the forest, what are the rules and responsibilities around that. And so in addition to like the philosophical or theological teachings in terms of the actual lives of the gods, they are also so interconnected with the natural world. And then I'll come to cows. Not just cows, but all animals are considered sacred, and the cow is given specific prominence because it says that the cow is the physical representation of the earth in Hinduism. And in the Bhagavad Purana, there's a specific story there where the earth takes the form of a cow, and the cow is being beaten. And the cow says, I cannot survive in a world where I am being beaten by bad people. And so there's this understanding in Hinduism that how society treats cows is a reflection on how we will treat the earth. And so that's why in Hinduism you'll see this reverence for the cow, because she's a mother, but she's also the representation of the earth. And for looking after cows, we look after the earth. And we see now in modern times, we see like the overproduction of beef and the exploitation of cows is one of the prime drivers of deforestation in the Amazon and so on like that, right? So you see that linkage there. And then this is manifesting, all these Hindu ideas are manifesting in a variety of Hindu environmental efforts, both in India and here in the West. I won't go into all of them, but there's a project in Maharashtra called the Govardhan Eco Village, which is run by Hindu monks who all studied at the best colleges in the US. Now they became monks and they have an eco village in India. The Save Soil campaign by Jaggi Vasudev, again, raised awareness around soil issues, which is not so well known within the general public. And here in the US, you have a number of Hindu communities now building cow sanctuaries, whereas before that was only prominent in India. I have friends in London who have a couple of cow sanctuaries. In the US, it's becoming a thing as well. So these are things happening under the radar that are happening. And I list all those projects. I'm not giving any comment or judgment on them. I'm just saying that these are some of the efforts that are taking place within the Hindu world. In terms of and that's a lot of work I've done. And in the last 2-3 years, my work has shifted more towards the mobilizing of religious communities at the United Nations to advocate on a variety of environmental concerns. Historically at the UN, there has been a focus on faith groups focusing on climate change for various reasons, which we can get into later if that's helpful. But there has been, and so what I have focused on the last couple of years is mobilizing faiths on biodiversity and ecosystem restoration, because there hasn't been a focus on those efforts at the UN from faith groups. And so the last couple of years, in the lead up to the Global Biodiversity Framework and COP15 in Montreal, I led the effort with some other faith groups to mobilize religious communities on advocating on biodiversity. So at COP14, the biodiversity COP that happened last in Sharm el Sheikh in, I think it was 2018, there were 2 religious groups that showed up to COP14 in Sharm el Sheikh in 2018. This time in Montreal, we had 30 religious communities showing up. And that was because of our efforts over 2 years to kind of normalize and popularize this understanding that biodiversity is an equal crisis to climate change, and you can't solve the climate change crisis without solving the biodiversity crisis, and vice versa. And so we had 30 different religious organizations and representatives in Montreal. We had over 20 events, meetings with the executive secretary and so on like that. And so what we've been able to create now is a center of gravity around religious communities talking about biodiversity, at least at the UN level, which didn't exist before. And so now our work is, now that we have the GBF, is to see how we then now move faith communities into implementing the GBF and working on biodiversity. And the good news is, which Chantel and Lisa were saying, is that faith groups on the ground are doing work on biodiversity, but because they're not environmental experts, they call it climate change work. They're doing ecosystem restoration work at the grassroots, but again, they call it climate change. And so part of our work is to do a mapping to understand, well, what is already happening when it comes to biodiversity with faith groups at the grassroots level, to show that there is sizable work going on. So that's the work we're doing with biodiversity. I mentioned I sit on the advisory board for the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, and so for the last year and a half, we've been working to talk about ecosystem restoration through the lens of spirituality, values, and culture. And so we had held consultations globally, looking at different ecosystems from Middle East to India to North America to the Philippines, to see how communities talk about ecosystem restoration, not necessarily through religion, but spirituality, cultures, and values. And so we did that work, and now we are in the process of doing two things. The first is that we are this year doing about 50 grassroots dialogues with religious communities on ecosystem restoration. We have a handbook that we produced in partnership with the UN Decade to do that, and so that will be happening this year, 50 grassroots dialogues globally. And then we're also producing 10 spiritual principles for ecosystem restoration in partnership with the UN Decade, literally in the middle of finalizing the design for that, and that should be ready to launch. We're looking for Earth Day, but it may get pushed back. And what we're planning to do with that is see how we can pilot with the World Resources Institute, WWF International, the UN Decade, to kind of pilot the engagement of faith groups on ecosystem restoration. We think it's a good idea. We think by engaging faith communities, you're going to have a much higher success rate in ecosystem restoration projects, but we don't have the data to prove it. And so the first phase is working with WRI and other institutions to kind of prove that this approach is important, that it works, and that it can be scalable, and that working with religious communities is not as scary as we may think from the outset. And so that's some of the work we'll be doing on ecosystem restoration, in addition to working with the UN Decade flagships, which were launched in Montreal last year. So that's some of the interfaith stuff. I hope I'm not going too fast. So I'll close with some thoughts and reflections that that a number of us who are kind of in this space, at, let's say, the more international level, are kind of thinking about or have been thinking about and are questioning. I'll start first from the Hindu side, which is, I'll say, at the moment, it's very difficult to be a professional or a public Hindu doing any kind of activism work. And I'm happy to talk more about that later and probably off the record, because that's not exactly what I'm here to talk about. But the kind of, yeah, let me leave it as that. It's difficult to be a Hindu trying to do work in the world these days. But in terms of the broader role of religion and the environment, I think some of the questions, there are some people whose job it is and who get paid to say religions are the answer to fixing the environmental problem. You know, 80% of the world are religious and so on. You know, I think a number of us are tired of that framing and are a little bit more critical about what is the role of religion or religious institutions and religious ideas right now when it comes to the climate crisis and biodiversity and other ecological issues. For example, we don't have a lot of time. Things are getting very bad. Religious organizations are extremely slow to move, very, very slow to move, and don't have the skills and the experience to move quickly and at scale. Right? And move quickly and at scale is one of the things we need if we are to avert the worst of the climate and biodiversity crisis. Right? So what is the role of religion and religious organizations in this particular moment? 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, the work was to mobilize religions to green their places of worship. Now, if every single religious institution greens their places of worship, well, that's going to take forever. It's never going to happen, right? So what is the role of religion in this moment? Are we up for the challenge? And I think that's a question that we ask ourselves in the religious environmental movement increasingly now. Where is our value add, given the magnitude and the varieties of crisis? And how are we working with other constituencies? Are we doing this work to green our own religious institutions, or are we doing this work to tell policymakers, the private sector, empower youth groups, work with indigenous people? Where is our influence? Again, how can we best be helpful? And then taking into consideration the changing demographics of religion, at least here in North America and in Western Europe, religion is on the decline. So what does it look like to mobilize people of faith in the West when young people are just not interested in religion anymore? Or they're not interested in their grandfather's religion. They're interested in religion in a different way. And so I think that's an important question that, broadly speaking, the religious environmental movement has not interrogated. And then adding to it's not the challenge, but adding to this mix is that there are new multi-faith environmental initiatives popping up all the time. I was just talking to Emily, like in the last month, I came across 2 new interfaith efforts to work on the environment, both hosted or connected with major institutions in the West. And so what you've seen in the last 5 or 6 years is a proliferation of different organizations saying we need to work with religions on climate change. To the point now where if you're a religious organization, you don't know who to go to. Do you go to the United Nations? Do you go to the World Bank? Do you go to the Aspen Institute? There is just so many now that it's becoming confusing as a religious actor to know where to put your energy to actually make an impact, because everybody, it seems like, is wanting to get into the game of religion and climate change. The final thing I'll say is the religious environmental movement, quote unquote, is largely Western-led. It's largely been led by individuals or institutions that come from a Christian lens, mainly Protestant, and that has meant that the movement itself has had a certain framing and a certain language and a certain approach, which comes out of like a Christian or a Western lens, right? And so I think some of the questions I think for the movement as a whole is, well, what does it look like when religion is on the decline in the West? What does it look like when geopolitics is shifting towards the East, where the religions there are very, very different and have a much different approach to theories of change and engagement? What does it say about colonialism and the power dynamics that are in play when it comes to these movements being Christian-led? And so I think those are questions that, again, the movement as a whole has not interrogated, but needs to, if it is to be responsive and be effectively engaging with the crisis. It doesn't make sense, for example, at the climate COPs, which I go to every year, for Christian leaders to be standing up and saying this, when Asia, is going to be disproportionately affected and has a disproportionate population of the world, right? So does it make sense that Christian leaders continue to be the leading voices in this space when Christianity historically has been responsible for colonialism and for a lot of the problems we see right now, right? And so I think there are real questions and conversations to be had there. So I'll leave it with that, if that's okay.
Thank you.
And happy to answer any questions.
Thanks. And I might start with a couple of questions.
Yes.
And open to the floor. There are a couple elements that wanted to suss out. One, a little bit, and this is just in terms of where research and awareness is for the overlap between traditional ecological knowledge, ecosystems restoration, and climate change, where regenerative action locally, we have an understanding of that being climate resilience adaptation. So I'm going to throw a couple,
Sure.
And then just another little clarification to talk about where is the discourse in systems change within religion, ecology, and climate, in terms of you were starting to get at this as the new actors that are suddenly coming in to religion and environment, and not knowing who to work with, who to trust, where the globalized systems of funding may be influencing that. And I do have some others, but we'll leave that for now.
So was there a question? I'm trying to.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
if you could talk about where the globalized funding systems may be influencing this current rise in religion and climate and ecology work,
Right.
and what you see as the implications on the work.
So I'll give an example that maybe can highlight some of the challenges. I remember around the time of COP15, I was doing a lot of work in India. COP15 being not COP15. What was the Paris COP?
19. Yeah, 19.
Was it COP19?
Oh, wait.
Paris?
COP 21.
COP. They all get mixed up.
COP 21 was Paris.
COP21, the Paris. I was doing a lot
Agreement.
of work in the lead up to COP21, mobilizing, working with religious groups. And a funder, and in India at that time was a major Hindu festival called the Kumbh Mela, which attracts hundreds of thousands, if not hundreds of millions of people, and it was taking place in Nasik. And we were going to do that. We were going to go there and have a campaign around solar energy and raising awareness about solar energy. And we had the Hindu sadhus and saints on billboards holding up solar lamps. It was great. But it was funded by a foundation here in the West, actually by a foundation here in DC. And what they asked me, they're not an Indian foundation, they're very much a US foundation. They said to me, when you go there, you should print these placards that says, Modi, we want this. Modi, we want that, right? And I had to push back and I said, and it wasn't anything against Modi, but I just said, that style of activism is just not culturally appropriate in India. You know, it might work on the streets of DC and New York and Los Angeles, but you go to India, it's uncultured to call people out like that in an Indian context, and I think in a lot of Asian context as well. And so I think that's the challenge, and I don't know if that's what you're getting at, is that a lot of the and a lot of what I see is the global interfaith work on the environment, on climate and biodiversity, is funded by Western institute foundations and so on like that, and they come at it from a very Western lens, thinking like we think in the West, that the Western disease is that we think everyone thinks like the West, and we know that they don't, right? And so they think, oh well, what works in the West is going to work in every context, in every culture, and so I think that is part of the problem. So I've been part of interfaith efforts that have been funded by Western groups that have tried to do work in India and Japan and Thailand, and they just don't know the culture. You know, they just don't know the culture. They think they know, and so I think that is part of the problem. And I don't know if there's a solution. I mean, there has to be a solution to it, but at the moment, it seems like there's just more and more Western bodies wanting to fund global interfaith climate work, and it doesn't seem like it's stopping. It's only increasing, and so I think the opportunity or the challenge is like, can the East match that or push back, and do the Western voices want to hear it? Like, for example, part of the challenge I said as being a Hindu, like if I say things now as a Hindu, I can very easily be labeled a right-wing Hindu, very easily, right? I have no connection to India. I have no family there, no business there, nothing, but there is no space as Hindu activism, right? And so even though I chair the UN's Faith Council, when I've advocated for vegetarian diets, I've been called a Hindu nationalist because a vegetarian diet is considered to be a high caste diet. Well, actually, a vegetarian diet is probably the best for climate change, right? And so that's part of the challenge now, is that although there's a lot of money coming in from the West to do global work, is the West ready to actually stay in its lane and let the East and Africa and South America do what they want? I don't know if I'm going off script, but yeah.
It's helpful to hear from that. And,
yeah.
Does anybody have? Okay.
One follow-up question
Yeah.
about funding, because in China we have a debate. This COP15 actually is hosted in Kunming,
Right.
first originally. And China is funding. We paid actually because I also pay tax for the government. We paid the minister from most African countries to have the good experience in Montreal.
Okay.
And you mentioned there's over 30 faith organizations appears in the Montreal.
Yeah.
So what's the Chinese government attitude would engage with those faith organizations?
We didn't have to engage with the Chinese government because the facilitation of the faiths and the engagement with the faiths was facilitated by the CBD Secretariat and the City of Quebec. And so we didn't have to engage at all with the Chinese government on the faith engagement with COP15. We work directly with this.
Is there any Chinese faith
any Chinese
organizations appears in this?
No.
Okay.
No. You know, and I'll be honest, we were quietly happy that it took place in Montreal, because our concern was if it took place in China, civil society representation was going to be severely curbed. And so, although it was freezing cold in Montreal, at least we were happier that we could actually turn up and do our work there. Yeah.
And in some of these global gatherings, there have been Chinese constituents coming through interfaith climate networks, but they do not come officially as Chinese constituents.
Yes, we have a law about NGO or something.
Yes, so they might be, yes, but there still are some voices coming in, but not officially, yeah.
Yeah.
I had a similar follow-up question, because when you talk about the groups that fund anything to do, that again goes back to colonialism, the structures of the world, who became active, who started to give money, and that's the way knowledge is also being generated today and has been produced in the past. Well, I mean, there are all these very wealthy people in the East and in India, as we know. Has there been